How do we as a community face disaster? Are we ready? Today we'll find out on Lakeshore Focus.
The Indiana University Northwest School of Business and Economics is the only public institution in the region to hold AACSB International accreditation. The program provides undergraduate business education with a balanced curricula based in leadership, teamwork, and technology. IUN serves both traditional and non-traditional commuter students in a diverse urban environment. Learn more at iun.edu/business.
Welcome again to Lakeshore Focus, a weekly show highlighting the key issues, important events, and interesting people in our region. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick. We've had some major natural disasters in our region in the past decade. Are we prepared as a community to respond? We're joined today by Sharon Kish and Gordon Johnson, who are helping to educate community volunteers on emergency preparedness through the Northwest Indiana Community Organizations Active in Disaster. Who came up with that name?
Well, there's organizations that are pre-existing. There's voluntary organizations active in disaster, and those are state-based, and that's a VOAD. And so the community organizations active in disaster are the smaller units, and they're COADs.
COADs.
And it's national. It's around the country.
So it's all over the place.
Right.
So we had our most recent big event was in 2008. I think we had a significant flood in this region. So how extensive was that?
The remnants of Hurricane Ike dumped on Northwest Indiana, and there were 19,000 flood-affected households in Lake, Porter, and LaPorte counties.
19,000?
19,000.
And it started raining, and it rained for like 3 days, and the water just kept rising.
Wow.
Yeah.
So of 19,000, you said flood affected. I mean, how many were just wiped out? Were there people just wiped out?
Yes, there were hundreds of homes that were damaged beyond repair. There were some homes that were just wiped away.
There were streets in Munster where the water was up to probably the eaves, and in Portage, a lot of the water came up through the sewers, so it wasn't just the river, it was the infrastructures couldn't handle all that water.
Now, this is not the first time we've had floods in this region. This is, I'm thinking back, having been here about 25 years, this is about our third one of these, right?
Keith, we've had 8 presidentially declared disasters in Northwest Indiana, all flooding disasters, since 2004.
Really?
Yes.
Now, I don't think people know this, do they?
I don't think if they're personally affected, or the friends or family members, that they don't actually know that it occurred.
8.
And some of those have happened in the farmland areas, down along the Kankakee, but the one in 2008 was the one in the little Calumet River that was just devastated.
So this has mostly been flooding. I mean, it's all been flooding, but we've also had some really significant storms that have, with wind damage and so forth, but none of those have ever been declared a disaster, right?
There were 2 F2 tornadoes that occurred and some major straight line winds, but they didn't damage so many homes that they were declared a presidential disaster.
So COAD steps in when a national disaster has been declared?
Or a state. The governor can also declare that there's been a disaster.
Okay.
So the COAD works year-round, building a network of relationships amongst the organizations that will play a role in responding to a disaster. So we keep the information flowing between us and the training opportunities that are out there for our mutual volunteers, so that when it does happen, we know who to call and when to ask for assistance.
So the one in 2008 really kind of the biggest one we've had?
It was a historic flooding event.
Okay.
Right.
So that was huge. And I mean, what happened? I mean, I've heard some of these pieces of we didn't get the levees closed, the Calumet River.
Well, you know, I'd like to compare it for a second. Earlier that year in 2008, nearly all of the rest of Indiana had flooding disasters. And so we were feeling a little safer up here in
A little smug,
Northwest.
perhaps?
Well, maybe not smug,
Not
but
smug,
safer.
a little safer up here
Yeah.
in Northwest Indiana. And then when we had the flood in September of 2008, the number of people affected and the economic damage as a result of it was larger than all of the rest of the flooding in Indiana in 2008.
Now, most of this came from just the heavy rains, right? But our region has a difficulty handling all this excess water. Is this the case?
That's really very
Right.
true.
As Gordon said, the levees were overflown. Sometimes the storm sewers couldn't handle that amount of water, or debris filled the storm sewers and they weren't working properly. So it was just kind of the perfect storm. Everything was happening all at once.
I don't think people realize, because I've seen this and having just flown recently, when you fly over Northwest Indiana on a clear day, we got a lot of water on the ground here, a lot of lakes, rivers, streams that I don't think people realize. So when we have these extensive rains, that capacity and being so fairly flat, it just can't get out of here that quick, right?
Well, that's exactly true, and there's geology behind it, and there's a gentleman who's written a book about it that underlying the northern part of Northwest Indiana is glacial alluvial debris left behind when the glaciers retreated, and so there is not the same kind of capacity to absorb water, and that's a lot of the reason why we have so many ditches that go out to Lake Michigan, and there's a number of rivers as well. There isn't the kind of carrying capacity for water, and as there's increasing development and paving over marshy areas and putting in roads and interstates, that's further reduced the capacity to absorb the water. So we depend upon it draining it from the surface into the lake.
You're sounding like a geologist rather than a Red Cross guy.
Well, we study these kinds of things so that we know where it's most likely to flood first and where the families are going to be affected first, so that we can stage materials, equipment, and supplies close by in anticipation of a disaster.
Now, has Chicago had these kind of flooding issues that we just don't hear about or pay as much attention because they're not directly affecting us, or we get more of it here? Do you know?
I don't know that.
We have flooding more often here, but because of the density of the population in the city of Chicago, they oftentimes have very extensive flooding with severe consequences for the people who live there that we hear little about in Northwest Indiana.
Okay. Now, I get it why Gordon is involved in this, because he's the American Red Cross, and I mean, this is what they're about. Sharon, why are you involved in this with United Way?
Well, United Ways have been becoming more involved in disaster work, because in the midst of a disaster, there are lots of volunteers, people who raise their hands and say, I want to do something. And so our job in the disaster is how to mobilize those volunteers who want to go out and help in any way, shape, or form. So they need training, they need to be registered, they need to be organized before they go out to do the work. And it's really the next step after the first responders. Obviously, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, and emergency management, they're doing rescue. They're out there, but then it's that next step in recovery. What do you do next? And that's where the United Ways are stepping up and really helping to bring our community back to a new normal, whatever that is.
So the role of a co-ed, just to kind of describe how it flows during a disaster, in immediate response is provided by the American Red Cross, and Homeland Security and Emergency Management do the evacuations. And the Red Cross provides food, shelter, and clothing to the people who are directly displaced from their homes until such time as other state and federal resources come to bear. So then the disaster has been declared as a presidential disaster, which allows for additional funds to flow for people to recover. And so they get various loans or grants for small businesses and individuals and use those funds to restore their homes or businesses to become functional. But then after that, There are people they've received FEMA dollars, they got assistance from organizations, but they still lack the resources to restore their home to a safe and sanitary condition. That's where the COAD launches a long-term disaster recovery committee that works to help people to completely recover in terms of moving into a home that they can have a household again. And then it's really up to the individual to complete their own long-term recovery, but the many organizations in the COAD work closely with them.
So there's two phases of this I clearly hear. There's kind of the immediate
Right.
response of just having to deal with it for the first 3, 4, 1 week or whatever,
Yes.
3, 4 days, 1 week, and then this whole recovery period, which in this last 2008 was a 3-year
3 years,
period?
3 years, yeah.
37 months
That's
is
right.
how long we ran the Larry Project, which was Lakeshore Area Resources and Recovery in Indiana,
Okay.
and which was a long-term disaster recovery committee, and did a fantastic job working with thousands of people to muck and gut out their homes. And
So part of this is trying to let our viewers understand what's going on, but part of it is because the kind of people who watch, we think, Lakeshore Public Television, the kind of people who probably are volunteering to help. So in that early stage, that first 24 hours up to a week or whatever, are there roles for volunteers at that point to jump in and help?
Yes, within 48 hours after the flood started, we had 3 volunteer reception centers up and running in the region. And people could come and we would register them and then we would send them out to sites, as Gordon said, to help clean up, to get the debris out, to sanitize before the mold started.
But in that early phase even, I mean, I think a lot of people think if I volunteer early, I'm going to be piling sandbags, right?
Well,
that's needed.
that's needed too.
Okay.
In the aftermath of a tornado, it may be chainsawing and getting all that debris out of the roads so the emergency responders can go in and the big trucks. So there's all kinds of volunteer roles. Not everybody is going to be doing that heavy lifting, but there's getting food for the responders. There's helping people who come in and get their own materials. We set up where they could get buckets and mops and sanitizers, so that kind of that inventory control.
So you don't have all the people lined up for this in advance, or do you?
We have American Red Cross volunteers to respond to the immediate needs of people. But for a longer term basis, there's a lot of volunteer help that is needed. And I would just say it sure would be great if people would volunteer now and get trained so that they can fit into a role that's available when it's happening.
How would somebody do that? That's a great suggestion. So if somebody says right now, I watched this show, I'm inspired here, or I feel like I want to jump up and volunteer, so I'm ready to go when the next disaster.
Well, and then the paper I just dropped, we're having 2 trainings. And one is to how to staff a volunteer reception center. And that's going to be on April 27th from 9 to 11:30 at the Porter County EMA. So if people come and get trained, we would put their names on a list so that they would be ready to go.
So actually a good answer besides this one would be contact the United Way or the American Red Cross and say, when's the next training coming up? Tell me, because somebody may watch this show on our website in July and may say, oh, and so they could call you and find that out, right?
And they can call us, or they can also call 211. We have 211 here in the region. They were a big part of our immediate response because they were the first call-in number. So, yes, so if people are interested, please contact one of us.
I want to go back to the human side of this for a second and talk about, because I just recently talked to somebody who I think through that ended up filing bankruptcy. They fought with their insurance company. I mean, that was probably a more common story than I think we realize.
The problem is FEMA, when FEMA comes in, they'll only give you up to $26,000 to either repair or to rebuild, and that's if the house is totally destroyed. Well, there's not many houses you can rebuild for $26,000, and there were many people throughout this region who had no flood insurance. And so if they had no homeowners policy, no flood insurance, they really were trying to figure out a way of what they were going to do to restore their home.
What did people do? I mean, if I'm just going to imagine I'm that person. If I've got a $200,000 house, I didn't have flood insurance. I get $26,000. Well, I use all my resources to fix my house?
Well, people also depended upon teams of volunteers
Right.
that we convened from local volunteers, and then later on we brought in trained volunteers and volunteer groups from throughout the nation who came in and worked in Northwest Indiana continuously until the project was ended after 37 months.
We were very fortunate in Indiana to have the Lilly Foundation, because during that year when there were all these floods, through the United Ways, we were able to bring in over $18 million to Northwest Indiana to help those families. And that the volunteers did the work, but the materials and some of the more technical skills, where we would have to hire people, were paid through the Eli Lilly Indiana Fund, it was called. And we were so fortunate to be able to have that. And that's how Lakeshore Area Regional Recovery, was formed. We were able to do that, and they did the work, and they went out over that 3-year period and helped those families.
So what did we learn from this? I mean, is there some things we learned in these last few, and the 8 that have come up that we're trying to be better at?
Well, the first Northwest Indiana co-ed was formed after the Highland floods in 2006 and 2007. And then that co-ed worked on the much smaller number of cases that there were of people who had unmet needs after they got all of the resources they could from local organizations and from FEMA grants. And there were about 120, 130 cases that we worked on trying to meet their needs. But our co-ed was smaller then, and this was in addition to everyone else's full-time jobs. So co-eds are totally voluntary. So what happened was the co-ed kind of fell apart after the job was done because everyone went back to what they were doing. So one of the really important lessons that we learned and have been carrying on is that the co-ed needs to be a year-round activity, engaging the organizations that normally would be responding to a disaster, so that we keep those lines of communication open.
And not wait till the disaster.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's not that we're completely ready for every disaster that occurs, but at least we have a starting place.
So is that working?
It is working. We meet monthly, and it includes the Red Cross, Salvation Army, emergency managers. We have some of the hospitals represented. The FBI is there. I mean, there's a whole group of people that are continuing to meet.
So what do you have to talk about if there's no disaster going on?
Some of these trainings, because we know that the more trained you are, the better the response is in the immediate aftermath. We are also doing get ready, get up, get ready trainings, because it's important, especially for your viewers, to know that people need to be ready to shelter in their place, their own home, for at least 72 hours, because help may not be able to get to them within that 72 hours. When streets are filled with litter, when
Roads are closed.
cell phones may not work. That's what they found out in Sandy, out on the East Coast. Cell phones didn't work because the lines were all down or they were overtaxed. So it is really important that people have water, that they have some food, that they have emergency radio and batteries, all those, and medicine, if they're on any medication, that they could stay wherever they're at for at least 72 hours.
So we did a show probably 6 months ago about kind of the individual response for this,
Right.
but I find it interesting. So people right now could volunteer and say, if my home's not affected, I would take a family in and get on a list.
You get on a list to do anything. Maybe
Okay.
we had people, if you remember during the floods, that set up stands with water just on corners so that if people needed clean water, so they were there. There are so many activities people can do when there is a disaster. It just needs to be organized, because the worst thing you can have is for volunteers to go into an area that's unsafe.
Is there something we can do to help people become more aware? Because the very opening comment was, if you weren't affected by it after the news kind of died down a few days, you probably it wasn't affecting your life in other communities. So how do we make people more aware
Well,
that it
I
still
don't know if
is?
that's true, because in that 3-month period, when after the floods, we had over 7,000 volunteers who came forward to say, let me do something, let me help. And then over the course of the next 3 years, there were hundreds of volunteers who came into this region, many from outside the region also, who were also willing to help. So people do step up. But if they want to be on a list, there's also www.serve.in, where you can go and be on a state registry, and you can tell people, if you have a chainsaw, or if you have a forklift, or if you just want to be a volunteer. So there's the state registry too.
So tell me, each one of you, maybe your favorite volunteer story, because this is a chance to maybe shine a little light on somebody who really went above and beyond. You can use a name if you want, or just say there was this person. You got a favorite?
I do.
Pardon me.
The Portage ROTC, the high school ROTC unit, said we're going to work together as a team. And those kids were so great. They went out in homes and helped people take out debris. They did mucking and gutting, which is cutting out drywall. But they were such a great team, and they showed up every single day after school, and they were there on the weekends, and they were such a great group of kids that went out and did an amazing job.
So when we hear those stories about kids today don't really kick in, here's a great example where our young people really stepped up.
Right.
You got a good one, Gordon, of somebody that...
Well, I'd like to let your viewers know that they can become a Red Cross volunteer online at www.redcross.org.
Okay.
We take all our volunteer applications online now. And I do have a little story about the Munster High School football team became sandbaggers at the initial onset of the emergency.
They do that for a workout or for
they went to work because there was a need in their community. And I think that's really important to address, that people see what's happening in their own local community, and then they step up to volunteer in roles that they just find. So if they become involved before the disaster happens, they can be prepared for it and get the training that's needed to sometimes deliver these volunteer services.
So those are great examples of both individuals. So individuals can step up, but groups of people can step up too. We're down to just a couple minutes here, and so just, again, something that we've really learned that we've got to do in the future differently.
Well, number one, planning. We have disaster drills now that all of us are involved in, where we will either do a tabletop where you plan, or we go out and pretend. There was a tornado drill not very long ago. A year ago, there was one that if there was a nuclear disaster, and there were school buses involved. So these drills, it's not going to prepare you completely, but it starts to show if there's any flaws in your system.
It's that run through.
The most important thing I think that everyone can do is to prepare their own household, to have an escape plan, to have a go kit, to get trained, to be ready, to know how to contact each other when there is a disaster, have a place outside of the area if they can't get home to convene themselves. So everyone needs to get trained and prepared for a disaster, because they happen all the time. Now, we don't know where the next one's going to be, or when it is, or what it's going to be, but we do know it's going to happen.
And we're going to be more
from the
prepared.
history of it.
Right.
And it's likely to be a flood in Northwest Indiana, although it could be something else. And so what do they need to do to be prepared to stay in their home or evacuate their home?
So I feel so much better knowing that you guys are involved in this, and we're doing some great things here. So I'm hoping our viewers will feel that same way. I appreciate all the leadership you guys are providing us, and thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. There is a famous quote from author George Santayana. It states that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Our life histories are filled with successes and failures. We strive to capitalize on those moments when we have triumphed and reduce the repetition of missteps. We also experience this same pattern as a collective in a community. There are times when we as a whole join together, creating a glowing brightness of achievement, and sadly sometimes delivering a period of poor results. Today's show presented a time where our local community had both a moment of poor preparation and performance, followed by a longer sequence of positive action and good results. Hopefully, we have learned something from the history of that event and many others. It is a constructive step to analyze and learn from the mistakes of the past and from the successes that also occurred. The essential part is to create an action plan that either addresses prevention of that mistake or a way to respond if it happens again. It appears that our communities may have learned something from our history, and we have leaders in our midst who have vowed to remember the past and not repeat those mistakes. Thanks for watching our show. Have we made you aware of what is going on in our communities? Your reactions and thoughts are always interesting to hear. You can send them to our email address, which is listed on your screen. I continue to encourage you to take a look at our website at www.lakeshorepublicmedia.org. From there, you can view previously aired shows. Click on the TV tab, scroll down alphabetically until you see Lakeshore Focus. Another click and you can see a list of interesting topics and thought-provoking interviews. Pick one and enjoy. We invite you to join us next week for another Lakeshore Focus. Until then, I'm Keith Kirkpatrick saying, make a positive difference in our world today.
The Indiana University Northwest School of Business and Economics is the only public institution in the region to hold AACSB International accreditation. The program provides undergraduate business education with a balanced curricula based in leadership, teamwork, and technology. IUN serves both traditional and non-traditional commuter students in a diverse urban environment. Learn more at iun.edu/business.